A deeply divided COP30 is about to wrap in Brazil's Belem without a consensus on fossil fuels. The latest draft of the agreement reveals that plans for a roadmap to phase out fossil fuels have been omitted. Notably, the phrase fossil fuels is not in the text. The issue is a matter of serious contention among participants. Several countries have demanded the inclusion of plans to transition from the use of fossil fuels, with up to 30 telling host Brazil that they would not sign off on a final deal without it. On a more positive development, the draft also called for global efforts to triple financing to help nations adapt to climate change by 2030. But there's no indication as to where the money would come from. The text is subject to further negotiation and needs approval by consensus in order to be adopted. The conference is scheduled to finish later today, though talks regularly run overtime into the weekend. Now, discussions were already disrupted yesterday when fire broke out, sending delegates, observers, and the media rushing for the exits. Fire alarms suspended talks taking place nearby as officials evacuated the venue. And joining us live now from Belem in Brazil is Rachel Teng, who is covering the developments for CNA. Now, Rachel, let's get to that fire first. What exactly caused it, and how has it affected that last day of negotiations?
Right, Angela. So, first of all, the good news is that everyone here is safe. There have been no deaths or major casualties due to the fire. The last update from the Brazilian host presidency is that 21 people were given medical attention. Most of them were treated for smoke inhalation, but a couple of them were treated for anxiety episodes following the incident. And I'm not surprised because it was indeed quite traumatic. 12 people have since been discharged. Last we heard, there have been no reports of any burn injuries from the flames. But as to the cause of the fire, this hasn't really been confirmed yet by Brazil. So we'll have to wait and see on that. And, you can also see behind me that they're trying to fix the big hole in the tentage roof that burned down because of the fire, this fire that started in the African pavilion. And all sidelines pavilions, all the country pavilions have been closed since yesterday. There are no more fun and games here. All the focus is now on the frontline talks. The stakes are very high as we move into, as you said, the final day of the climate conference. We've lost an entire day just because of this fire, and we do know that there's still a lot to be ironed out between the countries. And at the rate that the talks are currently going, many are expecting things to drag out over the weekend. We've seen past COPs typically drag out by at least a day, so we'll have to wait and see as to whether it will be more than that. So here at the summit, this morning when we walked in, there was an air of suspense that nothing else, hopefully derails the talks or overshadows the talks. This COP has certainly been a very eventful one, what with protesters breaking in last week, and at the very start, teething issues with heat and ventilation, and all of these taking over the headlines from what's happening actually in the plenary halls.
Yeah, and speaking of that draft agreement, which I think you're alluding to, that's likely to spark further debate now that all mention of fossil fuel has been dropped. Is there a possible compromise at this point?
Right, yes. So to give you some context, the latest draft agreement released at the start of this last official day of the talks has entirely dropped a proper roadmap for the phase out of fossil fuels. This has been a key point of contention this time around at COP30. And rightly so, because the burning of fossil fuels is by far the largest contributor to global warming. And more than 80 countries had written to the Brazilian presidency on the penultimate day, warning that they could not accept a final deal here that did not include a proper fossil fuel transition plan. Now, these countries include Germany, Kenya, and other low-lying island states who want to hold the world to a promise made at COP28 2 years ago. For them, it's been a long time coming. But oil-producing nations like Saudi Arabia have since, opposed this. And so the latest development is that all mention of fossil fuels have just been dropped. The draft also calls for global efforts to triple climate financing to help nations adapt to climate change by the year 2030, but it did not specify where the funds would come from, whether it's the private sector or richer countries, and this is also another point of contention. So as you can see, tensions are running high here. So let's hope that countries can come to a consensus soon. And this COP lives up to its name of being the COP of implementation, where we see states move beyond pledges into proper plans for climate action.
Rachel, thank you so much for bringing us the latest. That was Rachel Teng reporting for CNA live from Belem, Brazil. Now, more on that COP30 draft. The omission of fossil fuels signals a setback for many countries. But as our CNA senior correspondent Jack Board explains, nothing is final until an agreement is reached. And even then, there are few guarantees.
It feels like every year at COP at this late stage, as the final deadline looms, we do face a situation like this. There is this very forensic examination of the various drafts being thrown here and there by the various negotiating parties. In some ways, it's like a game of chicken, and it also relies on lots of subjective interpretation about individual words and language that's being used. If you ever take a look at these documents as they're being prepared, it's really quite indecipherable, I'd say, to a normal person. There's lots of jargon, lots of technical terms. I think many of these negotiators are probably turning to their thesaurus to find words with slightly different meanings. And what everyone is searching for, though, is consensus, and that's how these COPs work. Essentially, nobody gets to go home until everybody agrees. And when the discussions involve nearly every single country in the entire world, that's not so easy to achieve. There are lots of vested interests, polar opposite views of key issues. And that's how we get to this situation every year, essentially. I've been there, I've been waiting around for the final moments of the past few editions. Often they go well into overtime. You see the food catering stops, the national pavilions are getting packed up, temporary buildings are being dismantled, yet there's still no breakthrough at the main event. Normally, though, even when it does appear like everything might collapse, certain countries are threatening to walk away, it does come together. And of course, these ministers do have planes to catch, so that's something to always keep in mind. If we look at this text, we see the same types of issues and points of contention as in previous editions. The parties are looking to strengthen implementation of the previous commitments they've made. Things like renewable energy efficiency, how to raise ambition to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, how to mobilize more financial resources for developing countries, which are, of course, bearing the brunt of climate impacts. We see that in the latest draft, it drops efforts to secure agreement on how to move away from fossil fuels. Now, some nations, especially small island states, the Latin American nations, some countries from the global north as well, have been pushing quite hard in Brazil for a roadmap which would set out how countries should stop using the most polluting energy sources, coal, oil and gas. And this was a pledge actually made at COP28 2 years ago. It was in the final text to transition away from fossil fuels, and that was a big deal at the time. Really, before that summit, that kind of language just wasn't on the agenda at all. Now in Belem, we've seen some more assertive wording in the earlier drafts for this just, orderly, equitable transition, reducing dependency on fossil fuels, scaling up alternatives, and now that's clearly been watered down, even though the draft is not finalised. All of this language is politically charged, and it's also economically sensitive. It's tied to the prosperity of some nations and the survival of others. And what you have here, and what's curious, is Brazil right in the middle, wanting to appear to be a responsible actor, acting in the best interests of the planet, but also being a fossil fuel producer itself, and separately, away from COP, looking to explore options for new oil fields, for example. Of course, as well, one of the major issues with COPs and all the promises and the declarations is that none of them are actually legally binding in any way. Countries are not really obligated to do what they say. So while these texts are important, they are used as guides over the next year. Beyond that, at the end of the day, they are pieces of paper, and without concerted collective action, they won't solve the climate crisis.